I call the Honourable Judith Collins.
Mr Speaker, what a privilege to be able to speak to this most important bill, the Standards and Accreditation Bill. And I know it's important because of the quality and the length of the speeches that have preceded mine, which of course will not be a read-out speech prepared for me by Winston Peters, but in fact will be my own. Having said that, if there was any doubt in the minds of the public as to the need for this bill, all I would say to you is this. Labour, the Greens and New Zealand First are against it, it's got to be good. If in doubt, if they're for it, be wary. They're against it. They started off being for it. I was a bit worried then, but now I know we're on safe ground. So even though we have so much fun in our Commerce Select Committee, with a really good-natured chair of Melissa Lee and deputy chair of Mr Brett Hudson, and also my dear colleague across from me in the table, Claire Curran, we have so much fun. I have to say, you know, we do occasionally disagree, and that gives me hope. Because with total agreement in Parliament, well, that's not really democracy, is it? Opposition's job it is to hold the government to account and occasionally let us know why we're here. So I just think it's fantastic that the person who's resumed his seat is so concerned about the stopping trade. Well, actually, it's all about the other way around, really. What this is about is actually saying, do you know, the standards people have been working really hard for a long, long time. That's the problem. It's taking too long for standards to come through, and standards that are around trade and business, and this is a country of trade. So yes, the legislation that this is going to replace, has been around a long time too. So long that even the previous Labour government decided it needed a review. So what's happened between the previous Labour government deciding that this legislation needed a review, standards and accreditation legislation needed to be reviewed and changed, and now, well, what's happened is actually about 7 years of opposition for them, actually, and that's about it, really. Can't find anything good to say, so they're just not bothering to say it. Unlike me, of course, who's always looking at the positive, along with my colleagues on the Commerce Select Committee. And I say, it's so good being the MP of Papakura. Everything's positive, apart from that terrible thing we had the other day. So, having said that, seriously, standards and accreditation is important. It's important for business. It's actually also very important for our consumers. Because we're all consumers, aren't we? I mean, we all expect certain standards, but actually in most cases, standards are not compulsory unless it's legislated for or regulated for. And the previous speaker, and I'm not going to try and remember who he is, anyway, the previous speaker, he said something about how so much of the bill, or the working parts of the bill, will be taken care of by regulations, order in council, and therefore will not be subject to the democratic process. He hasn't been very long in Parliament, so I'm going to tell him this. We have the Regulations Review Committee, actually, and regulations can be reviewed by that committee. That is a very powerful committee of Parliament. It's so powerful that I've never been appointed to it. And I'm sure the Speaker has been, though. Yeah, you're on the right side there. I never have been. And that's just too powerful for someone like myself. And what that does is it actually looks at those regulations. It takes complaints from members of the public, it takes complaints from MPs, and it can actually bring about changes. So it is a significant, I'd say, check on the executive and the power of regulation making. So members should be aware of that and take that into account. One of the reasons why you wouldn't want to have a bill like this with all of the detail about regulations and everything that we would have in regulations in it is because of the fact that it takes a long time for legislation to come through the House. The fact that this piece of legislation has been incubating since 2007, tells us that it takes an awfully long time for such contentious legislation to come through the House. Now, what that says to us is if you want anything changed, you need to have the power to make it changed quickly, particularly if you're dealing with trade. Do you know, if everything was fabulous in the whole standards sphere, then we wouldn't be bothering with this, would we? Really, would we? And the fact is, no, we wouldn't. It's not fabulous because the legislation that's repealing has been around since 1988. I don't think DNA was even being used in 1988. Everything's changed since then. The Testing Laboratories Registration Act, that's also being repealed, and that's from 1972. People on the opposite side will remember that year. It's the year Labor won. It was a big year. It was the year my family voted Labor, about the last time, but there you go. And having said that, I think it's really important that we try and keep up to date with things. So I see no problem with the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment having some responsibility. It doesn't mean to say that they are in charge of how the standards are made or what standards are made, but actually it means you have a minister who's responsible. If there's not enough funding, if there's not enough standards coming through, and I'd say that to the opposition, you'll be able to actually really hold the minister to account in the ministry. So I think that's a really good thing. And Mr Stuart Nash, MP for Napier, says that's an excellent thing. Well, wouldn't that be wonderful, Mr Nash? And while I think of it, isn't it great news standards-wise and accreditation-wise that the Honourable John Banks has been exonerated today? Well, what good news for justice coming through. Fantastic. And I think all those people who thought such bad things about the Honourable John Banks, my good friend, might like to now about now apologise, but there you go. That would be requiring standards from the opposition. So, oh yes, and Ms Moroney says, come on. Well, no, I know Ms Moroney, you wouldn't be up to it, but anyway, I'm sure Mr Nash would. So, because he's the next leader of the Labour Party, and I think that will be an interesting day when that happens. But standards are really important, quite seriously, around our trade. And we are a little country. We are a trading nation. This is how we make the money that pays the taxes, that, by the way, pays our salaries, that pays the working for families, that pays those who are having to be dependent on the state. It's how we pay for things, is actually by trade. We're never going to survive trading with ourselves. 4.5 million people, fewer people than there are in Melbourne, is not enough for us to be able to survive on. We can't all knit things that we want to get by from each other. It's not going to work like that. What we need to do is trade. And we are competing against some massive markets and some really big players. If we look at some of the huge players that our exporters have to deal with and actually have to compete with, we need standards that they can in fact say, these are New Zealand standards and these standards mean something. It's all very well to say it's all been fine in the past, but actually, do you think the leaky home issue came about because of excellent standards? Do you really think that did? Do you really think that that helped? I don't think it did at all. I think it's time for a government to take responsibility on standards, and this government is putting its hand up and saying, we will take responsibility. And that's a really good thing. We're not telling which standards should be approved, we're not saying how to do it, but we are saying this is important and we're going to take responsibility.